Let's talk about a fascinating question. What if the very thing that makes you powerful is also the one thing that's destined to destroy you? Well, today we're jumping into the anatomy of a fall, looking at Risa Wakatsuki, a character who is the absolute embodiment of that contradiction. She's a figure of incredible authority, but her entire life is lived on the knife's edge of a total collapse.
And this right here, this single analogy is the key to understanding her entire story. Just picture it, a high-performance jet engine, built for power, for precision. But the very energy that lets it fly creates this intense, overwhelming heat that will literally melt it from the inside out if it's not constantly vented. That tension, that's her. It frames everything she is and everything she does.
So if you've got that kind of pressure building up inside, what do? Well, you build a fortress on the outside, right? So let's start there, with her carefully constructed public persona, an armor of untouchable power and absolute control.
You know, her design is so consistent for a reason. Every single thing you see here is a tool. The sharp hair, the professional clothes, even her pendant and earrings. It's all designed to scream high-status professional who is in complete command. And those piercing red eyes? Oh yeah, they're not just for show. They're a bloodline trait called the keen eye or Jagin, and they give her some pretty serious supernatural abilities, like perfect mimicry.
And this just drives the point home, doesn't it? It doesn't matter if she's a supernatural inquisitor in reinforced armor or a strict teacher in a pencil skirt. The purpose of the outfit is exactly the same, to make her an authority figure you do not mess with. Both uniforms are basically armor, meant to keep everyone else at arm's length.
Okay, but underneath all that armor, that engine is really starting to overheat. So let's move on from the external shell and talk about the internal vulnerabilities that are threatening to just shatter that whole controlled facade.
Which of course brings us right back to our big analogy. What is this internal pressure? What's the heat that's threatening to melt the whole thing down? Well, it's funny you should ask, because depending on which story we're looking at, there are two completely different and equally destructive answers. So in the first version, the threat is a literal magical fire. I mean, the very power she uses as an inquisitor is this unstable, volatile force that just builds up and up inside her, and the consequences, well, they're devastating.
It's this incredibly dangerous chain reaction. Every single time she channels her elemental magic, it creates this byproduct called spirit heat. If she can't get rid of that energy through a specific ritual, it just keeps building until it triggers something called a soul detonation. And yeah, that's exactly as bad as it sounds. Her soul is literally destroyed from the inside. Her greatest weapon is basically a self-destruct button.
You know, this huge contrast between the cool, collected inquisitor on the outside and the woman on the verge of exploding on the inside, that's totally on purpose. It's a storytelling concept called gap mo. It's all about the appeal we find in that gap between who a character pretends to be and who they really are. And that tension is what makes her so incredibly compelling.
Okay, but let's pivot. Because in the other version of her story, the threat isn't magic at all. It's her own mind. Her own dangerously impulsive nature becomes the spark that lights the fire of her downfall. It's a psychological heat, and believe me, it's just as destructive as any magic.
So we've got two different sources of internal pressure, one magical, one psychological. And now we get to see how these two vulnerabilities lead to two very different kinds of deconstruction, two very different falls from grace.
You can see the two paths laid out so clearly here. In the supernatural story, her fall is really a psychological transformation, and it's kicked off by an enemy. But in the adult deconstruction, oh man, it's a total social takedown, and it's triggered by her own actions. It's the same core character, but the outcomes couldn't be more different.
Let's dig into that first path. Her fall here is all about pride. She thinks of herself as a master tactician, this artist who uses a precise surgical skill called perfect mimicry. So for her, having to resort to something as messy and, crude as an elemental bomb, that's not a victory. That's a tactical failure. It's shameful. So her big psychological fall is when she finally, reluctantly has to accept that the raw, messy power she despises is actually her most effective tool.
Now for the second path. This is a total fall of status, and it is brutal. Her own impulsiveness gets her caught in a compromising situation at school, and that one single moment, that's the trigger. It opens the door for blackmail, and her authority gets systematically dismantled by students and staff. She goes from a position of absolute power to complete powerlessness, crushed by the very people she used to control.
So after looking at these two very different narratives, what's the big takeaway? What do they both tell us?
Well, they actually reveal this single unifying theme about the nature of her power. And there it is. This is the core idea of her character. It doesn't matter if it's her volatile magic or her impulsive personality. The very thing that makes her so formidable is also the exact source of her undoing. The engine that allows her to fly is the same one that's destined to melt her from the inside out.
And that's why, in the end, her fall always feels so inevitable. Because it's an inside job. That armor of authority, that perfect facade of control she built, it was always fragile. It was always destined to be shattered by the raw, chaotic nature, whether it was magical or psychological, that she was trying so desperately to keep locked away.
Which really leaves us with the central question that her entire story poses, doesn't it? It's probably why we find characters like this so fascinating. Is true strength really found in building that perfect, flawless wall of control, no matter the cost? Or is it found in the difficult, terrifying, and maybe even necessary act of accepting the raw, chaotic nature that lies inside all of us?